Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. Let me ask you to picture something for a moment. When you hear the word Buddha, what image comes to mind? For many, many people, it's the round, smiling figure you see in restaurant entrances or on garden statues. A big belly, relaxed posture, maybe a laugh that suggests life is going pretty well. But here's the strange thing. That figure isn't actually Siddhartha Gautama, the man whose teachings started Buddhism. The smiling, portly figure most people recognize today comes from a Chinese monk who lived nearly 1,500 years later. And it turns out that misunderstanding is only the beginning. Because for centuries, after Gautama's life, artists didn't show him as a person at all. Early Buddhist art avoided human images of the Buddha. Instead, followers used symbols, an empty throne, maybe a set of footprints, a tree, a wheel representing his teachings. It wasn't until hundreds of years later, as Buddhism spread across Asia, that statues and human portraits of the Buddha began appearing, which raises an interesting question. If the early followers of Siddhartha Gautama didn't even depict him as a person, how did his ideas spread across thousands of miles? How did a philosophy born in northern India travel along caravan routes, cross deserts and mountain passes, and take root across an entire continent? And why is April 8th still observed in parts of Asia as the traditional birth date of the man whose teachings helped shape some of the largest trade networks in the ancient world? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain stories that changed business forever. Each date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, April 8th, that story takes us back more than 2,000 years, when belief started moving along the Silk Roads. Before we go any farther, I want to pause for a second and talk about a phrase you'll probably hear in this story quite a bit. You may have heard historians refer to something called the Silk Road. The name makes it sound like a single highway stretching from China to Europe, but that's not really what existed. What historians are actually describing is a vast network of trade routes that connected civilizations across Asia. Caravans carried goods across deserts, through mountain passes, and between cities that served as trading hubs. Cities that would come into creation, go through their existence, and fade right back out again. Silk from China was one of the most famous commodities moving along these routes, which is why the name stuck. But merchants were also carrying spices and metal goods. They were carrying precious stones and textiles and ideas and stories. So remember, there wasn't just one road. Routes shifted constantly depending on politics and climate and which cities were safe for merchants that year. So when historians talk about the Silk Road today, what they really mean is a web of Silk Roads connecting India, Central Asia, China, and eventually the Mediterranean world, which led into Europe. And it was along those roads that the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama began traveling far beyond the place where he first shared them. See, he was born in what is now northern India or southern Nepal, likely sometime in the 6th century BCE. Tradition says he grew up surrounded by comfort and wealth, protected from the harsher realities of life. But encounters with illness and aging and death pushed him to abandon that life and search for a deeper understanding of suffering. Years of study and meditation eventually led to the insights that would form the foundation of Buddhism. And those ideas began spreading outward just as merchants were moving increasing amounts of goods across Asia. Monks and merchants soon found themselves traveling many of the same routes, and over time the relationship between the two groups would quietly reshape the commercial networks of an entire continent.
I always had to be so good, no one could ignore me. Carve my path with data and drive. But some people only see who I am on paper. The paper ceiling, the limitations from degree screens to stereotypes that are holding back over 70 million stars. Workers skilled through alternative routes, rather than a bachelor's degree. It's time for skills to speak for themselves. Find resources for breaking through barriers at tearthepaperceiling.org. Brought to you by Opportunity at Work and the Ad Council.
As Buddhism spread outward from northern India, it didn't move the way many religions did later in history. There were no large missionary campaigns backed by governments. There wasn't a central authority directing where it should go next. Instead, it traveled the same way most ideas moved in the ancient world, with people. Monks or pilgrims or translators and merchants carried Buddhist teachings from one region to the next as they moved along those Silk Roads. And over time, Buddhist monasteries began appearing in many of the cities and caravan stops along those routes. These monasteries served a spiritual purpose, of course. They were places for study and meditation and teaching. But they also became something else. They became infrastructure. Travel across Central Asia was dangerous and exhausting. Caravans needed safe places to stop and reliable water sources and communities where strangers could find food and shelter without immediately being treated as a threat. Buddhist monasteries often provided exactly that. Merchants could rest there. They could store goods or exchange news about routes and bandits. They could make donations that supported the monastic community. In return, monasteries became trusted waypoints along the trade network. And this is where it helps to remember something about Buddhism itself. Today we usually describe Buddhism as a religion, but many of its earliest followers understood it more as a philosophical path for understanding suffering and living ethically. Teachings about honesty, right conduct, and what Buddhists call right livelihood created a shared moral language that merchants from very different cultures could recognize. Over time, that shared framework helped create trust between people who might not share the same language or nationality or government. And trust, as it turns out, is one of the most valuable currencies in long-distance trade.
Wish your life came with a warning app?
That dog does not want to be petted.
Well, life doesn't always give you time to change the outcome, but prediabetes does. Take the 1-minute test today at doihaveprediabetes.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and its pre-diabetes awareness partners.
If a baby is giggling in the back seat, they're probably happy. If a baby is crying in the back seat, they're probably hungry. But if a baby is sleeping in the back seat, will you remember they're even there? When you're distracted, stressed, or not usually the one who drives them, the chances of forgetting them in the back seat are much higher. It can happen to anyone. Parked cars get hot fast and can be deadly. So get in the habit of checking the back seat when you leave. A message from NHTSA and the Ad Council.
What makes more of this story unusual is what happened next. Most belief systems remain centered, close to where they began. Their institutions, their leadership, and cultural identity stay tied to the original region. Buddhism didn't. Although Siddhartha Gautama lived and taught in what is now northern India and Nepal, the center of Buddhist life gradually moved away from that region over the centuries that followed. Part of that shift came from changes inside India itself. Hindu philosophical traditions absorbed and competed with many Buddhist ideas, and some rulers began supporting other religious institutions instead of Buddhist monasteries. Another turning point came in the 12th century when several major Buddhist centers of learning, including the famous monastic university at Nalanda, were destroyed during invasions in northern India. Those institutions had served as the intellectual and educational backbone of Indian Buddhism. As they disappeared, the tradition weakened in the place where it had begun. But by then, Buddhism had already taken root elsewhere. Across Central Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, Buddhist teachings had been translated into new languages and woven into local cultures. Monastery schools and artistic traditions continued developing there for centuries. In a sense, Buddhism followed the same pattern as many ideas carried by trade. It didn't stay where it started. It thrived where the networks supporting it were strongest. Which is why today, when most people picture Buddhist temples, festivals, or statues, they often think of East Asia rather than the foothills of the Himalayas. And that brings us back to the date on the calendar. Like many figures from the ancient world, the exact birth date of Siddhartha Gautama isn't known with certainty. The date was chosen later by tradition. In Japan and parts of East Asia, that traditional birth observance falls on April 8th, a symbolic moment marking the birth of a teacher whose ideas traveled across continents, along the same networks of roads, merchants, and cities that connected the ancient world. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, do me a favor and take a moment to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people discover the history behind the business decisions that shape our world. And if you want to actually understand business better, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.